Kevin, talk about Christianity in Hollywood, because you mentioned it, and it is one of those things. Obviously, I know a couple people who are in your industry, and they all say the same thing. Man, you come out as Christian in Hollywood, you're pretty much screwed. Now, I grew up watching John Wayne movies with my father. That's what I did. And it's not as if those were Christian movies, but it wasn't hard to hear John Wayne talk about God and faith in God. You never hear that anymore. Why is Hollywood so against Christianity?
I wish I knew. It's crazy out there. You know, and Andrew Breitbart is the one who said politics runs downstream from culture. Who runs the culture? Hollywood does. Hollywood, for the most part, look at Warner Studios. Most of Hollywood was pretty conservative back then in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. Things started shifting in the 50s and really shifted in the 60s when you had this whole, the Vietnam War, you had the civic rights, you had the hippie movement, the free love, ban the bra, feminism, all this kind of stuff. And Hollywood really shifted the way it made movies. It started celebrating the bad guy. The bad guy became the hero. John Wayne was out of a job. I mean, it's crazy what we've done to the world right now. And movies, back in the 1950s is when Walt Disney said movies and television will influence our youth. Well, I think old Walt was pretty spot on. And I think he'd be spinning in his grave right now to see what Disney is doing to his brand.
I agree. Talk about boys being boys. You wrote this book, The Test of Lionhood. It's something that drives me crazy, Kevin. Actually, you and I and your bride have talked about this in person before, about the education system and how it's all designed for girls in this country. It's all aimed for girls. Go sit there, one hand on each knee, be a pretty little princess for 8 hours a day. Well, that's not how 7-year-old boys are made. I have 2 of them, and that's not how they are.
Not at all. Completely different. I got 2 boys and I got a daughter, and they get along just great, and they're who they are. You know, one's a woman, one's a man. I mean, we put a woman on a Supreme Court that couldn't get a definition of a woman. That was unbelievable to me. I had to laugh when that happened. Well, I'm not a scientist. Well, neither am I. But you either got a penis or a vagina. There you go. So it's like, it's crazy what we're doing. We're celebrating craziness, and it's got to stop. And I think more and more people are starting to get sick of it. And to me, it's, the reason that I wrote the book is they came to me because they saw me talking about we got to wake up the lions. And they said, you played Hercules for 7 years. You're Captain Dylan Hunt on Andromeda for 5 years. I've done over 80 movies. And most of those movies, I played a guy. I played a man. I played a guy's guy. And they said, we want to do a movie about, embracing masculinity instead of toxic masculinity. It's just crazy what's been happening. So this is a book that it's a story of this young cub. I'm going to put it up there again. It's this young little buck right here. And he's out with his sisters in the woods. She gets cut. The youngest one gets cut by this very poisonous plant. And he freaks out. He knows he doesn't have time to go get back and get dad, because he knows the only way to save his little sister's life is to go the opposite direction, up to the mountain, to get this one flower that is able to save her life. So he goes, he's got fear going against him. He's got all these obstacles, but his dad taught him to be a man and be brave and not let fear rule his life. Because as you know, the favorite weapon of government is fear. And we saw it in full display during COVID, where you had to fear everything, and government loves that. And trust me, they're going to do it again. And in fact, they are doing it again. But this is a wonderful book to show that you can celebrate being a man. Because here's the thing. I think that the Barbie movie, big success, $1 billion. But everybody I know that's seen it, guys say, oh my gosh, the whole movie is about bashing men. You don't need a man in your life. You don't need a family in that life. You're women, just be a woman, be on your own. You don't need anybody. And you see it being played out left and right. You brought up climate change, which I call weather, but a lot of people don't want to have kids now because I don't want to bring them in this world because, the world's not going to last much longer. I still remember seeing, John Kerry, the weather czar, saying that the North Pole is going to be gone by 2014. Well, it's 9 years later, John. It's still there and it's doing just fine. So they love doing this thing about controlling your life and keeping you in fear.
How do we get to this place where our foreign policy has oftentimes, it seemed many times, especially over the decades, involves getting in a conflict where young men die with no clear objective? Historically, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen in my life, and yet that's American foreign policy. We'll get involved, young men can die, and there's never a clear objective. Just go die for a while, maybe something vague like hearts and minds, but other than that, good luck, fellas.
Yeah, I mean that's the problem with an ideological approach to foreign policy. One, right, one that is focused on ideals that are really hard and slippery to get your hands around, as opposed to kind of the kind of real tangible issues of national interest, the kind of irreducible national interests of your safety, your economic prosperity, the American way of life here at home. Right, those are things that you can wrap your arms around. Those are the things that you can understand why people would go fight and potentially make the ultimate sacrifice for. But when you've expanded those war aims, like we did in Afghanistan, well beyond those vital national interests, then again it gets slippery, right? Because lots of different interest groups, especially when you're involving lots of different countries. We had over 40 countries involved in the ISAF campaign there. Everybody's got a little bit of a different answer to that. Different Americans had different views about why we were there. Was it to build girls' schools in Helmand? Was it to promote a campaign against Al Qaeda? Was it to rebuild that country in our image? Was it something that even mattered very much, especially after the Iraq War started and we turned our attention? Again, just a terrible approach. And really, I think an approach in Afghanistan that shows you the problems of American foreign policy writ large, right? We have not focused on our vital national interests. That has not been the focus of American foreign policy. Instead, we've had these goals of what we might call primacy, which is not very tangible, but this idea that America has to remain dominant in all of the major parts of the world. But what does that actually mean? What are we willing to spend blood and treasure for? And then also these ideological goals of democracy promotion by the bayonet that we saw in place after place. And these have all led to failures, right? If you think about the Iraq War, the ultimate failure of the last 30 years of American foreign policy, right? 4,000 Americans dead, tens of thousands wounded, trillions of dollars spent, and for what? Afghanistan, similar. Again, not the original project in Afghanistan, but the nation building project. Then you have Libya, which is an underrated problem in American foreign policy, right? Where you had arms flowed out, terrorists flowed in, you had a civil war in the country, you had destabilization of areas around it like Mali, and then a refugee crisis that led to destabilization in Europe due to hundreds of thousands of refugees going into Europe. So just so many own goals. Syria, right? That's another one. Oftentimes ill-defined projects that we throw soldiers and airmen and Marines and sailors at, but oftentimes ill-defined. I mean, look at our Syria project. Are we there to help protect Kurds? Are we there to promote the future of regime change against Assad? Are we there for ISIS? Right? All of these things coming together, no one really understanding what we're going to do when we leave, what our exit strategy is. And Colin Powell told us, 30 years ago, you got to have an exit plan, right? That's how you make sure that you don't get bogged down in these forever wars. But again, it's all about this very ideological primacist agenda that we're seeing that is very much in contrast to an America First approach that looks at America's vital interests and then makes trade-offs and where we could tell soldiers, hey, this is why you're going downrange, this is what you're fighting for. And it makes sense if your parents get a letter someday that it meant something for your country.
William, what do we make of the drastic increase in suicide? Study came out today. Veteran suicide has soared tenfold in the last 15 years. That is so awful on so many levels. In what ways, I'm sure there's more than one, are we failing the men and women who go fight for this place?
Yeah, I mean, it's terrible to see this, to see people come back from overseas or see them come, end their lives when they're in service to their country. It's just a terrible tragedy. And I'm not sure what we can do, right? The military puts a lot of resources into trying to protect the mental health of its veterans. I know that when I came back from Afghanistan, I was there in 2008, 2009, and we had to transit back through Kuwait to go through some of this kind of post-deployment training to make sure that we had resources available to us, to make sure that people who had issues, particularly those who faced combat, that they had some of those resources. But once they get back to the U.S. into their lives and their communities, particularly for people who transit out of active duty or who are reservists, they may not have the support around them that they need. I guess the message is that if you're a veteran and you're struggling with mental health issues, get help. Talk to your fellow soldiers, airmen, Marines, sailors. Don't just keep it bottled up. I think what our country needs to tell them, what I'll tell them right here, is that we value you. We value what you did. Even when we were let down by civilian leaders and even military leaders at the Pentagon, that you did your duty. You did the best that you can do, and that we honor that. I always put the challenge to our civilian leaders when they get us into these wars that oftentimes have these deleterious effects on the home front, not just abroad. That's why we have to make sure that we're only fighting wars that are absolutely necessary, because these things have just terrible consequences. My grandfather was a veteran of World War II. He fought in the Battle of the Bulge. He was wounded and was in a POW camp. And, people struggle with those experiences. And, I think that we're putting more effort into that than back in my grandfather's day to try to deal with some of these problems. But, they're still terrible. War is hell, as kind of famous saying goes. And again, that's why we have to have a restrained approach to foreign policy, right? Do what we have to defend our national interests, but don't go well beyond that in a way that actually undermines our safety and undermines our security here at home, and puts a grave, I think, cost on these people who come home after fighting these. And again, the issue of the returning warrior has been one that is as old as literature itself. It goes all the way back to Odysseus and Homer, right? And in an early part of my career, I did a fair amount of research on this, about how combat and military service affects things like marriages, how it affects communities. There's lots of research out there on how it affects these individual soldiers and the warriors that we send to war. And a lot of that research shows just how costly it can be. And so it needs to be part of our cost-benefit analysis when we decide to go to war, because, think of all those veterans that are coming home and facing these problems. Let's not just think about the schools we've built abroad, or the fact that we can claim a kind of an initial success like you saw after the Iraq War, and then it peters out.
Governor, you and Governor Youngkin are focused on the Secure Your Vote initiative. Can you explain to people what that is and why this is something the GOP as a whole, all 50 states of them, should be doing the same thing?
Well, we know that in Virginia, anyway, that we have been losing when it comes to the absentee ballots and early voting. We can't afford to do that. We've been going into election day, 10,000 votes down, 14,000 votes down. That's not going to work. So we have, of course, absentee ballots, and we've got to start doing absentee ballot voting. The other side, they're getting their voters who are not likely to vote unless the presidential election or a gubernatorial election. They are getting those people to the polls by getting the ballots in their homes 45 days before election day. We have to do the same on the Republican side, because if one company, let's say, has a bite at the pie for 45 straight days and the other company doesn't show up until election day, who do you think is most likely to win? So I'm not even voting at the polls anymore. I'm voting absentee ballot. And here's the thing, finally, when I got my letter telling me that they received my application, they said, from now on, the election board said, from now on, they will send a ballot 45 days to my home for every special election, every general election, every primary election. I don't have to do anything. And it's sitting here for a whole 45 days. Think about that.
Delivered to your home. The vote delivered to your home. That way you never have to remember to wake up on a Saturday here in Texas. All right, before I let you go, Governor, tell me about this wonderful book.
Yes, so my book, How Sweet It Is really about the American dream and about some of the tragedies that I've faced, and that we have to rise up from the ashes. That can't waddle and after you grieve, you've got to get up and keep moving. This is your one life, and this is all when you have children, you've got to make sure that you show them the way, you give them hope. And it also talks about some of the political, I want to say, idiocracy that I faced being a Black Republican, and how we just need to let each other be. And by the way, I hope that as Republicans, if I don't vote as a, Democrat, then I am not Black enough. I think we need to just let each other be and vote however you want to, and let's come together for the good of the nation.
And I think the first part of this issue that should be articulated is AI is kind of a fancy thing. First of all, it's 2 letters. It means artificial intelligence.
Joining me now, somebody who probably, I can never guess, but probably knows a little bit more about AI than Dome does. Joe Allen, he's the author of the book Dark Aeon, Transhumanism and the War Against Humanity, which is out today. Okay, Joe, well, we don't have to get into Dome's explanation. Would you, first of all, for those of us who are old, explain what transhumanism even means? What is this fancy college term?
Well, Jesse, I think you need to think about the changes that have happened in just the recent past technologically. Think about trans children. Think about smartphone children. Think about autonomous weapons such as drone swarms. Think about just the power the internet has had over political movements. That's been a sweeping change in the last 2 decades. Transhumanism is the desire to accelerate that change, and accelerate that change to the point that human beings aren't just dependent upon machines. The human beings have actually fused with their machines, quite literally, including anticipated anyway, brain implants to connect one's mind to artificial intelligence. It sounds very sci-fi, not unlike a World Wide Web sounded sci-fi in the 60s when that project began. I wrote the book to really map out the ways in which this belief system has come to occupy not only the most powerful militaries on Earth, including our own, especially funding through DARPA, but also the most powerful corporations on Earth, including especially Google. And your listeners will probably recall that the wealthiest man on Earth, Elon Musk, is working not only on an artificial intelligence system that he anticipates to be superhuman at XAI, but also a brain implant, Neuralink, to link one's mind to that AI.
Okay, I'm 42 going on 82. This is so far beyond me, Joe, that I want you to keep going and explain this to me. How far away are we talking about when it comes to this kind of technology here? Brain implants that are communicating with AI? Surely you're talking about 500 years from now, right?
Well, Elon Musk anticipates 5 to 10, but he's always known for overselling. One thing that I think Elon Musk gets quite right is that we are already cyborgs. This is something he's repeated many times. Transhumanists talk about this all the time. The radical changes that have taken place, not only socially, but psychologically, due to the ever-present smartphone, and people have basically melded their lives to that smartphone. They see that as a stepping stone on the way to, first, non-invasive brain-computer interfaces. These are regularly used, by the way, just skull caps reading the brain. These are regularly used in, say, cognitive therapy. Even in video gaming, NextMind has a commercial non-invasive brain-computer interface. But when you're talking about actual brain implants, a lot of people are surprised to learn that there are already implanted brain-computer interfaces that allow locked-in, paralyzed patients to move cursors on screens, to actually, now they can type words. They simply think words, and it goes through the electrode into the computer and types out the words, and also to control robotic limbs. Neuralink is just getting started. They just got FDA approval, so they'll have human patients very, very soon. But BlackRock Neurotech, funded by Peter Thiel, hit the 50-patient mark just this year. And then another smaller company, Synchron, whose CEO, Tom Oxley, speaks a lot like Elon Musk on this. He doesn't see it just for locked-in paralyzed patients, of which they have around a dozen who are troded up with brain-computer interfaces. He sees it as being a future commercial product so that human beings, in his instance, can share their emotions electronically. For Musk, it's more of an intellectual endeavor. How do you keep pace with artificial intelligence as it blows past humans? That is the central mythos to transhumanism, that artificial intelligence and all of these technologies, artificial intelligence, robotics, brain-computer interfaces, genetic engineering, that all of these technologies are going to draw human beings up to the next level, in essence, to make human beings like gods. This is how they speak of it oftentimes. This is how it's spoken of among the critics. And I think that people, if they do not wrap their heads around this ideology, this notion that human beings are to be saved by technology, that technology will in fact be the highest power in the universe, that they're going to be in for a lot of surprises, even if the tech stagnates. What you see at the World Economic Forum, again, what you see at Google, what you see at Meta, what you see at OpenAI and Microsoft, what you see in academia from Oxford to MIT to Harvard, and of course, what you see among the real cutting edge scientists at DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, at the US Department of Defense, and other military scientists across the US military. All of them are voicing this viewpoint, this mythos, that the future of humanity is to merge with the machine. And as if it wasn't creepy enough that they would want to kind of draw consenting adults into this, the mass rollout of one-on-one AI tutors, I think will have a profound transformative effect on those students who actually adopt it, of which I anticipate it to be many millions, as it's being pushed by Bill Gates or Khan Academy. Both of them are doing this. What you're talking about is taking away that transmission of culture from a wise adult, presumably a knowledgeable adult, guiding a child or children through their lessons into something like intellectual maturity. And you are transforming that process into one in which a child simply learns from a machine. A child becomes conditioned and dependent. And eventually, you could say that without a brain interface, there is a sort of human AI symbiosis, a sort of relationship in which without that computer, the child is somehow naked, or the child is somehow unarmed, unable to think normally. Now, if you've known any children who are already completely addicted and attached to their smartphones, you know that this process really is already underway. And so there's 2 or 3 different options from here, but unless you think that this is it, that we've capped out, that the technology will go no further, I think that the viewpoints of transhumanists, even if you reject what they want entirely, have to be taken seriously, because these technologies do appear to be converging and rocketing ahead.
Joining me now, Michael Pillsbury, the Senior Fellow for China Strategy at the Great Heritage Foundation. Okay, Michael, break this down for me as if I'm stupid, and I am. What is lithium and why should I care?
Well, lithium is one of a family of what are called rare earth elements. And they go into the manufacture of all modern things like jet fighters and automobiles and you name it. All of these things are called rare earth elements because they're rare. They're very expensive to mine. They're hard to locate in the first place. In the second place, there's not a lot of profit. So private companies are not too attracted. The Chinese got onto this 25 years ago or more. They realized in some internal secret studies in China that if they could buy up the source of these rare earth elements, which are all over the world, especially in Africa, they could dominate industrial production in the future. How they did this, it looks like they had some help from Western scientists. So you're seeing the unfolding of about a 25-year strategy they've had to try to dominate rare earth elements, lithium being one of them. It's important because of its role in batteries, having batteries keep a charge.
Okay, Michael, can you explain to me why it wouldn't be profitable? And I ask that because just basic economics say, okay, it's rare. You say we need it for all kinds of things, so it's limited and we need it. That sounds like to me it should be about the most profitable thing in the world. Why is it not profitable?
Because you had to know a great deal about the future of the economy and the future of industrial production 25 years ago to know that it was going to be profitable then. Very few people knew that. How the Chinese are able to get ahead of economic growth and figure out what to do is a mystery. We know to some degree how they do it, but it's not just lithium and rare earth elements. Right now, they've got a theory in China that the future of world economics, the future of profit, if you will, is going to be data. It's going to be electronic commerce. It's going to be able to use your cell phone to do all kinds of things and have artificial intelligence on it to make even more sales according to the pattern of your previous sales. They have committed hugely, as Mr. Trump might say, their economy to a data-driven approach. We have not done that. We're still kind of in the old brick and factory approach of going to a shopping center, saying, I think I'll buy that, and then paying with a credit card. China has anticipated a number of areas in the future where they are bidding heavily on their view of how the world is going to make profit. And we are simply not doing that. There's all kinds of reasons in terms of competitiveness why the Chinese are pulling ahead of us in so many areas. But it's not just rare earth elements and lithium. It's not just a data-driven economy. There's several other areas, as many as 10, where they're pulling ahead of us in the military field as well. They've invested heavily in drones and hypersonic missiles. Our own military has thought this was too futuristic, too reckless. So we are behind in those areas now. Yeah, I think you get the big picture, Jesse.
Oh, great. This all is sounding pretty much freaking horrible, Michael. Let's rewind just a minute ago to something you said. For a bunch of different reasons, they're ahead of us. Well, I mean, we got 10 minutes here. What are the reasons?
Well, one reason is the ideology of our leadership. As you know very well, we have a commitment in a lot of our CEOs that diversity, equity, wokeness, that these are important issues. And so our workforce has to be tailored with these issues in mind, as opposed to the Chinese approach, which is really a very old-fashioned philosophy called mercantilism, that what is best for the market, what is best to dominate the world market is what China should do. And one example where we see this happen, we used to have a total monopoly in the US on the top capitalized corporations in the world. There's an annual Fortune 500 capitalization index, and it usually was all American companies, some Swiss, some British, zero Chinese. That's 20 years ago. More recently, the Chinese have surpassed us. They have more largely capitalized firms than we do. In the top 10, for example, the majority are Chinese. Top 4 banks in the world now are Chinese banks. If you go into a broader set of indicators, there's just a number of areas, the number of supercomputers. I'll tell you one that I had to laugh. The Chinese have now surpassed us, Jesse, in the number of billionaires in China. There are roughly 600 billionaires in China. We have about 500 billionaires. So you would think there'd be some indicators that we would be ahead, but there's very few. That's one of our projects at the Heritage Foundation. We're going to publish an index of these top 50, even 100 indicators, where it's just jaw-dropping how we have fallen behind over the last 10 or 20 years. And part of it, as I say, is the attitude of our leadership. If we had a Congress, if we had a White House that was totally focused on American primacy, American continued domination of technology, global markets, the military balance of power, we behave a lot differently than we do. The Chinese have that approach. So they may make mistakes, they may have cycles of up and down in their economic growth, but overall it's this really zealous commitment in China to becoming number one in the world that's driving them, and we just don't seem to have it.
Okay, something that else concerns me, and gosh, we could spend all day on that. Something concerns me greatly, and that's how many of America's leaders, business and political, they seem to be invested. We'll put it to you that way. Invested uniquely in China. Obviously, most recently, we have Jennifer Granholm consulting with China about U.S. oil reserves. But that's one of, honestly, I can't stand her, but that's one of a million examples I could give of our people seem to be bought off pretty easily by their people, and their people don't seem to be bought off that easily by our people.
That's a good indicator, the number of people on either side who are bought off. I would agree with you. A lot of American leaders behave as though part of their duty is to help China. Now, this began with President Nixon and Henry Kissinger in the Cold War with the idea of balancing the Soviet Union, but it went much further. And when the Cold War ended in 1990 or 1991, that you would have thought we would start seeing China as a competitor then, but we did not. We continued, for example, to let the World Bank have the largest offices in the world in China. The World Bank's greatest partner for loaning money became China. And the Chinese, over time, got the largest share of any country in carrying out World Bank contracts. So that's just one example of many where our leadership's consensus is a kind of wishful thinking that we owe it to China to help them grow and develop. And this is part of our duty, is to help this poor, backward Chinese country get ahead. Unfortunately, they did that. They're now ahead of us in many ways. We're still ahead of them slightly in total GDP. They're about 75% of our GDP. But the Soviet Union never got more than about 20% of our GDP. The war against Japan in World War II, that was a country, the Japanese at the time, about 10% of our GDP. But it still took us almost 3 years to defeat the Japanese. So we've created this modern China, something that President Trump used to say a lot. We built China. It's quite literally true. And its policy is still in effect, even as they are beginning to pull ahead of us now in so many areas.
Okay, Michael, can you speak on how China is doing financially? You just mentioned their GDP being 75% of ours, but I take a step back and I look at all the vast quantities of wealth they're spending around the world, all the Belt and Road stuff and otherwise. These ghost cities they build that go empty, they have to tear them down. They devalue their own currency. There's a long laundry, plus the lockdowns. There's a laundry list of things China does that from the outside looking in, I look at it and I say, my goodness, financially, they have to be on shaky ground. How are they not on shaky ground?
Well, in a way, if they drive themselves into a ditch by following the wrong economic policies, that's really our only hope. Because so far, our own leadership has not been galvanized by China to pursue more powerful competitive strategies. So if the Chinese, they're quite capable of making huge errors. 1958, they made a huge error called the Great Leap Forward, where Chairman Mao decided all farmers ought to eat together in the same cafeteria, and everybody should pool their land and have communes. Well, the GDP sank like a rock. There were up to 10 or 20 million deaths because of a famine and because of these bad policies. So that's the case that a lot of Chinese remember, that the Communist Party ideology can lead you into making fatal economic errors. They recovered from that. They made another set of errors in the 60s, the so-called Cultural Revolution, where once again the GDP fell. There were many, many deaths, and they recovered from that only after many years. So that is our hope, that China now is on, as you put it, Jesse, shaky financial grounds, that they'll make errors, that 75% of our growth of our GDP is the highest they'll ever get. That's called the peak China theory. The Economist magazine, the Wall Street Journal are all pushing this now. The Chinese are pushing it too. They're saying, don't worry about us. We're never going to surpass you. We're on shaky grounds. And they have a set of indicators of how they're doing relatively poorly. For example, their average per capita income is only about 1/10 or so of what our per capita income is, or what the Swiss and French and Germans are. So they play that, they try to pretend like they are the weak country, please continue these policies we have of helping Chinese growth. I myself, there's bulls and bears on China's future. I'm more on the bullish side. I've seen them pull themselves out of these disastrous decisions time after time. And what they've got on their side, I mentioned this term mercantilism. Mercantilism means you build up your own foreign reserves. In the old days, 250 years ago, it was your gold. Now it's your other instruments, such as U.S. Treasury bonds. The Chinese have almost 3 trillion in their foreign reserves. They can draw on this reserve power to stimulate their economy when they need to. Yeah. We can't. We have almost no foreign reserves in America. We have the gold in Fort Knox, but that's about it.
For too long, we've been led to believe that communism is a thing of the past. But the truth is, communism is alive. It's here, and it's infiltrating every aspect of American life. Introducing the Anti-Communist Manifesto by Jesse Kelly, the practical guide for patriots ready to defend our nation from its most dangerous enemy. Discover the shocking extent of communist infiltration in our education system, their alliance with American corporations, and the twisted truth behind environmentalism. This eye-opening book exposes the true face of communism and empowers you to fight back. Join the fight for freedom. Pre-order your copy of the Anti-Communist Manifesto today by going to jessekellybook.com.